Hello, bonjour, and oki to everyone, and welcome to Nonprofits at 2. I'm Karen Ball, President and CEO of CCVO, Calgary Chamber of Voluntary Organizations. Thank you for joining us. It's great, although not surprising, to see such interest in today's conversation. We're joined today by over 200 members and guests from Calgary, Alberta, and Canada. In looking at the guest list for today's event, I could see that there are many here that I have met before, know well, haven't seen in a while, and many more that I have yet to meet. Hello to you all. I'm really looking forward to the day when we can safely meet again in person. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the place where we at CCVO are fortunate to call home. We honor and acknowledge the traditional Treaty 7 territory and oral practices of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina Nation and Nakota Nation, and the Métis Nation Region 3, whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. As a settler and an ally, I am so appreciative and proud to call Mohkinstsis home. We are all treaty people. A sincere thank you to the supporters of Nonprofit at 2 who make these gatherings possible. Today's gathering is supported by the Muttart Foundation, PwC Canada, and Suncor Energy Foundation. I'd also like to recognize and thank our media partner, Postmedia. Before I introduce our panel, a few points about today's gathering. During the panel discussion that takes place over the first half of this session, you'll be able to submit questions for live question and answer portion in the second half. At the end of the event, you'll also have a chance to answer a few short questions of your own about your experience today. We hope you'll take the time to complete the short survey and share your thoughts with us so that we can ensure that Nonprofits at 2 remains relevant and responsive to your interests and needs. I'm in the moderator's chair for our discussion today, and I am very excited to introduce our guests. Joining me today are Janet Brown. Janet has over 30 years of experience in public opinion polling and has developed a knack for asking the right people the right question. And I know this for a fact because she's a former CCVO board member and a member of our Public Policy and Government Relations Committee. In partnership with journalist Paul McLaughlin, Janet publishes Wild Ride, a quarterly report that weaves political insight with proprietary polling and provides clients with a no-agenda assessment of Alberta's rapidly evolving political scene. Janet has recently delivered guest lectures at University of Calgary, Mount Royal University, and Concordia University in Montreal. She's co-author of a chapter in Orange Chinook, Politics in the New Alberta, that analyzes the publicly released polling from the 2015 Alberta election. So polling data being all the thing, welcome, Janet. Second, Mark Henry. Mark is president of Think HQ Public Affairs Inc., a Canadian public affairs strategy consultancy specializing in providing clients with strategic counsel in development of public government relations approaches with in-house opinion research as a foundation to strategy development. Before founding Think HQ, Mark served as Chief of Staff to then Mayor Bron Kanye and Vice President Public Affairs Alberta for Ipsos Reid. He's a graduate degree from the University of Calgary, specializing in Canadian and US politics and political behavior. Mark's specialties include brand, reputation, issues management, crisis communication, labor relations, message ad testing, and program evaluation. Welcome, Mark. Third, Dr. Lindsay Teds. Dr. Teds is a scientific director of the Fiscal and Economic Policy Program at the School of Public Policy and an associate professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Calgary. That's a long one to get on a business card. Lindsay is a specialist in applied economic research and political analysis with a particular focus on the design and implementation of tax policy. She's served on several expert panels and is the co-author and editor of several books, including one of her most recent books, Funding the Canadian City, and has published a number of books, chapters, technical reports, interactive guides, and papers in peer-reviewed journals. Welcome, Lindsay. And last but certainly not least, Zane Belty. Zane is a partner and VP strategy for Northweather, bringing a decade of experience in political, business, and nonprofit communications, as well as marketing and engagement. Zane is a frequent public speaker and regular political commentator who appears weekly on CBC radio and television and co-hosted the 2019 federal election for CTV, which was awesome. In addition, Zane chairs the board of the Canadian Children's Book Centre, serves on the board of the YMCA Calgary, and the Education and Lifelong Learning Committee of the Calgary Foundation. He's also city co-chair of the Banff Forum. Zane served as campaign manager for Calgary Mayor Naheed Nenshi in 2017 and has worked on the campaigns for US Senator Elizabeth Warren and US President Barack Obama. He's hosted the award-winning podcast, The Strategist, and his writing has been published by the Toronto Star, Globe and Mail, and National Post. Welcome, Zane. What an amazing panel. So without further ado, let's dive in. We're in budget development season, as everybody knows. Federally, there'll be a budget early in the year. The municipal budget adjustments are occurring now. So earlier this week, we heard from members of the public about those municipal adjustments in City Council and ongoing throughout this week. And the provincial government is in the midst of seeking feedback for their 2021 budget. CCVO will be publishing our formal feedback next week if anyone is interested in that. My question to the panelists, and we'll go around, is the multi-billion-dollar question: what can nonprofits expect to see from these orders of government in the budgeting process? And Janet, maybe I'll ask you to kick it off for us.
Okay, well, you know, I think all levels of government are facing the same general issues, and we're going to have lots of time to talk about that. But one of the things I wanted to start off by highlighting was, you know, we've got 3 levels of government, each working on budgets at these sort of crazy times. But, you know, you can never forget that each level of government has a different jurisdiction, deals with different issues. So the budgeting process is always very different as a result because of, you know, their unique areas of jurisdiction. And the other thing that you shouldn't lose sight of the fact is where each government is in terms of the electoral cycle, because that's going to influence like the budget process as well. So the federal government, for instance, they've been in power now for over a year, and we have yet to see a budget from them, right? Admittedly, COVID's had them occupied. We've had some updates. We haven't seen a proper budget from them. So this budget is going to be interesting because it's their first budget. They're also a minority government. So there's a very good chance we could be looking at one of those classic drop budget, drop the writ kind of scenarios. And the budget could, you know, be the introduction to an election. So that makes the federal budget just kind of a unique animal for that reason. Then you look at the Alberta government. Well, this government is the one that's farthest away from an election. So they've got a different sort of calculus. Any government in the middle of their mandate, they can afford to become a little unpopular. Maybe this government is pushing the envelope of unpopularity a little bit too far, but re-election is not as top of mind with the provincial government as it is with some of with the other 2 levels of government. And then finally, the municipal government, you know, they're working on a budget which will be the last budget before the next municipal election. And a couple of weeks ago, Mark and I did a panel on this upcoming municipal election, and it's going to be wild, right? We already know that not just in Calgary, I think we're going to have a lot of seats that open up. The mayor's chair may be opened up. We're going to have provincial plebiscites. We're going to have Senate elections. So this is the last budget before the municipal election, and it's going to be wild for all of those reasons. So could say a lot more, but I just thought I'd sort of put that on the table first.
Great first grounding. And Mark, I'll go over to you. Anything you want to add into that?
I agree with what Janet said. I think the other thing to bear in mind is when you're thinking about budgets, and particularly funding from different orders of government, remember capacity in addition to that. So the federal government has boundless capacity. They have a very healthy sort of credit account, and despite their protestation, so does the province. The municipal government, on the other hand, as you're probably anybody who's watching the budget deliberations, they don't have the same flexibility. It's illegal for them to run an operating deficit, and they have frankly a systematic problem with their taxation in terms of the distribution between commercial and residential property. So they are going to be really strapped for cash. Province and the feds have considerably more flexibility.
Thank you. Lindsay, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I think I'll go in the reverse order from Janet, since we're just talking about the municipality. And full disclosure, I did sit on the City of Calgary's financial task force, so I am quite familiar with their situation. The impact of COVID on the City of Calgary and all municipalities cannot be understated. Right now, really the saving grace was that COVID not only reduced revenues, it reduced expenses. So we kind of have a little bit of a short breathing room here, but there is a long-term and very concerning financial impact with the City of Calgary, which, given what council's saying, they're going to put it off until after the election. So new council is going to have to make the real hard choices. And we were already expecting property tax defaults for the next cycle to be devastating. Let's just put it that way, right? The city got off lightly this year with not very many property tax defaults, but it's going to hit hard in the next cycle. I'll echo what Mark says. Like, the Alberta government has lots of fiscal room. Again, doesn't feel like it, particularly, with everything that's going on. But when you look at their fiscal update, which I went through, it is still based off of very concerning assumptions. The forecast is assuming Keystone XL moves forward, and that is a big question mark given the outcome. Do we have an outcome from the US election yet? But that is definitely a concerning risk. We still have oversupply of oil, and Saudi Arabia and Russia are just not predictable players in that area, and so there's still risk there. And this fiscal plan also didn't expect, or isn't based off of a very concerning second wave that we are in. And so much like its budget in February, which was tabled, like 10 days before the World Health Organization called the pandemic, this seems to just not be rested in reality. So there's going to have to be, given the language in the fiscal update, more spending cuts, because that's all they talk about in this fiscal update is spending cuts. There's no hint at revenue considerations there at all. And then the federal government, I think we're going to see some really interesting stuff. We got the economic update on Monday. They've got oodles of fiscal room, despite, some people worried about it. There's nothing to worry about. And it is clear that they are joining with the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, the EU, New Zealand, all these other countries to do the Great Reset. And that means we are going to focus on sustainable and an inclusive economy. And I think that this is great, because there's too many people who say that government has to stay out of these things because, the free market takes care of it all. It doesn't. Look at the discrimination we have. Look at the racialized disharmony that we have. These are things that absolutely need to be addressed. And I think we're finally going to see some action on a key file, which would be childcare.
Thanks, Lindsay. And Zane.
Oh my goodness, so much has already been said. So let me just. No, this is good. It's a good. I think it's a very astute set of perspectives. I might just add a few things, and Mark talks about capacity. Let me throw in another one. It's painfully obvious, but maybe more nuanced with our COVID cycle, which is ideology. Right, so we have ideology also making an impact here, and so on the municipal side, right, backed into a corner, can't do much regarding revenue solutions because you can't run an operating deficit. So to be blunt, expect cuts, right? Expect cuts and expect the main priority to try to solve the revenue problem that we talked about. On the provincial side, knowledge would say that ideology is going to be a driving force of this budget, but another thing we have seen is COVID has been used as cloud cover. Right? Using COVID to unearth what the actual deficit is, using COVID to perhaps do things that you may not have had a chance to do, to just see our federal counterparts in terms of what they're trying to do with the Great Reset, to Lindsay's point. So my question is, does this government provincially use COVID as cloud cover? Are they trying to scare us perhaps with some, it's going to be bad, it's going to be bad, it's going to be bad? and maybe be less bad when they introduce that budget. I sense there's some sense of that. I don't think any revenue solution is coming down on the provincial side either. They've boxed themselves into that corner with the plebiscite stuff, which we can talk about, and the tangled knot that is. But what I'm looking for is Monday, right? On the Fed side, Monday will explain to me if the appetite that the federal government had with the extensive throne speech that they made to end chronic homelessness, to bring in pharmacare, to do childcare, to outright like start eroding the left with the NDP federally and start taking away a lot of their core policy planks and say, yep, we can do that, that, and that. What part of that gets teased into Monday, and what from that can we telegraph is part of their appetite? Because if I'm a nonprofit or charity right now, I'm probably expecting my money, if I'm looking for grants, to flow through from the federal side. Net new innovations on the federal side to solve big problems, maybe less provincial and even less municipal. So Monday, I wouldn't read the tea leaves super hard, but I would read into it a bit to say, is their appetite still there to do the Great Reset, to do the big spending programs? And a part of that's going to be based on what they feel like the pulse of the larger public is, which we could then talk about advocacy as related to that going forward. So just some capstoning thoughts to what's already been said.
Perfect, thank you. And I think it's really great kind of frame to say we're in different election cycles, different governments have different levels of capacity. We're in the middle of a global pandemic, and then we have different government ideologies sort of guiding us. Zane, you touched on how some of these things may or may not affect the nonprofit sector. So what are the priorities of each order of government, and specifically, where might those priorities intersect with the priorities that we know we're holding collaboratively within the nonprofit sector? And Mark, can I get you to maybe kick us off on that?
Sure. In terms of priorities, I don't think the priorities are all that different if you take it up to a higher level between the orders of government. They sort of fall into two big baskets. One would be resilience, which is, okay, between now and when everybody gets their shots in the new year, how do we get through this and have as few people, you know, sort of lose their jobs, lose their livelihood, so on and so forth. So how do you do that? Then on the other side of it is recovery. How do we actually get the economy going again, getting people working again, sort of returning to some sense of normalcy? And certainly within the next 18 to 24 months, those are sort of the two competing issues. And then the third sort of longer term is, okay, how do we pay for all that? Wow, that 2020 was an expensive year. I mean, the debts across the globe are going through the roof. And there's going to need to be a discussion about how that gets paid for. And that's where Zane's comments about the, you know, ideology and the philosophical outlook of the government will have an impact. The other thing to bear in mind, and this is the tricky part about the federal budget coming down, what usually happens with that kind of funding is it's cost shared. So the province can actually be a stumbling block to you actually getting that money. Because if they don't pitch in, then federal dollars don't flow. That's just the way the feds typically do these things. So that's also a bit of an issue. But in terms of the priorities and the messaging from the not-for-profits, I think it will vary depending upon the nature of the nonprofit itself. Those nonprofits that certainly service the notion of resiliency or providing that service to people who are hurting and in need right now, you certainly have a compelling argument on both sides. Those who don't, I think you really need to focus on, you know, the recovery side of things. And I don't think not-for-profits do a particularly good job of messaging their contribution to the economy. When you think about the number of people employed and the economic impact, and so going above and beyond what it is you actually do, that has a big impact. And certainly if I'm a government and I'm interested in getting this economy going on all cylinders once everyone's had the vaccine, if that ever happens, you're not going to want to have, frankly, jobs in the not-for-profit sector falling off because you weren't able to survive through it. So in many respects, I think you need to emphasize that the not-for-profit sector is very much part and parcel of economic recovery. And frankly, it's low investment, high return for governments.
Yeah, thank you. I cannot help but walk through the door and say it's 450,000 jobs in Alberta and $10 billion in GDP, in case you're looking for those stats top of mind for your own advocacy. Lindsay, do you want to jump in and add to that?
Yeah, I sort of have two thoughts, just, you know, building off of what Mark is saying here and some of the work that I'm doing in British Columbia and things that we learned from the CERB. Government can't get benefits into the hands of the most vulnerable people. They can't. We've learned that. And it's going to have devastating consequences. So one of the aspects I know, like, I mean, we can talk about data and data linkages and using databases and what have you. But certainly in BC, we are looking a lot to the nonprofit sector to help find people and make sure that they are supported through applying for the benefits that they have. I mean, BC is a little bit of a different government. And there's lots of help there, not just COVID, but also in regular times relative to it. So, you know, that could be an angle that this Alberta government might find appealing. In the sense that it takes the administrative burden off of the government, who's not very good at finding people and treating them in a non-stigmatizing way, whereas, you know, this sector certainly does in a much better way. And then I do actually think that those in the arts and culture sector are going to see some heavy funding available to them from the federal government, because it is a key area that was hit hard by this pandemic. And it is an aspect of life that a lot of people are missing. And so to be able to get a lot of that back, I think will be important to the federal government.
Yeah, thank you. I hope so. Ever optimistic about that, but yes. And Zane, do you want to add in?
Yeah, you know, I almost look at it as if there's two swim lanes that a nonprofit or charity right now may want to consider. And I don't think that they're competing against each other, but there's a little bit of friction. Let me just throw it out there as a theory. The first swim lane is on efficiency, right? To what Mark has been saying, the impact that the nonprofit sector has on job growth, on economic growth, and frankly, if you're a government with an ideological perspective of starting to take things out from the public service where costs might be higher and download them, that efficiency angle is a good one to play. There's also the other angle, which is maybe where you have to get a little bit louder and maybe you have to be have elbows that are a little bit sharper, which is as governments go from the resiliency bucket to the recovery bucket, to make the argument that we exist because normal wasn't good enough, right? And that normal, going back to normal, which is your government's goal or a government's goal, is something that for us and the people we serve, it just can't go back to normal. We need to go normal plus, right? We need to have this sort of build back better mantra that's been floated around to be very much strongly part of the core belief of government. So, you know, there is an opportunity. Swim lane number one, we're efficient, we can deliver services, we have an economic impact. Swim lane number two, you know, not kick and scream, but strongly advocate that we need a recovery that is more comprehensive, that is bigger, that is not just about getting back to normal, but now's the time to not just paper over, but rebuild. And that's where I think the exponential opportunity is in that second swim lane, but it really is the balance of the two. So, you know, I think that's where we might see certain charities being in certain sectors in terms of the swim lane that they push for their advocacy. Some might say, hey, listen, we're great service deliverers and we can do what, you know, you may have in-house and do that and we can execute it. And others might say, no, our thing is that we want to have a society that looks very different. In fact, that was our mantra pre-COVID, and it certainly is post-COVID because it's exposed the vulnerabilities, and we now need to create a better XYZ. You know, healthcare system, housing system, arts and culture sector, right? So I think those are the two swim lanes that I kind of throw out there, at least in my mind. I'd be happy to hear from my panel colleagues if they contest or they agree with that theory. But there is something to be said about having to make a choice in some ways, and perhaps having a bit of both in how you plead and how you kind of communicate to governments.
Yeah, thank you. And Janet, anything to contest or add to that?
Well, It's hard to back clean up on a panel like this because there's not too much left to say. But I will say I really liked Mark's point about resilience. And Karen, you'll remember when we had our last public policy government relations meeting, that theme of resilience came up, and I think that's I think the not-for-profit sector is very well positioned to talk about its role in creating a resilient society. And I had a few notes, and really the only thing that hasn't been covered is, and this is more of a provincial concern, but I think all governments are focused on this, is red tape, right? You know, this government's got a whole ministry of red tape reduction and stuff like that. And part of like sort of streamlining the bureaucracy, eliminating red tape, I do think the sector has an important role to play there. And we've talked about this in our committee meetings, is, you know, I think the not-for-profit sector, there's an opportunity for them to talk to government about what kind of rules and regulations are holding them back, because this may be the time to get those removed, and talk about how the not-for-profit sector can be a partner in helping, you know, government get through its efforts to reduce red tape. Lots more to talk about, but everybody covered things so well.
That's great. Zane, do you want to follow up in that?
I did. There was something Janet just brought up, which reminds me of Mark's point. You know, we talked about the municipal government probably being the one that's backed into the corner the most, with their inability and then the structural inability to generate revenue. I would also not ignore them, because there is a case to be made that what we see with the feds, we've seen Fed funding go straight from the feds to the municipalities. Rapid Housing Initiative being like an interesting case that we saw across the country, right? The money went, and what we also know is that the Fed relationship, at least in, let's say, our province, seems to be stronger with the big city mayors than it does with the provincial government. And we've seen a lot of that telegraphed and a lot of like sideswiping regarding that. So there might be something to be said of downloading from feds to municipality, where there could be auxiliary services, program funding, et cetera, executional funding to be had. So I wouldn't entirely ignore the municipal government, because they might be broke, so to speak, but there is something to be said, right, around the fact that they might be part of dispersing some of the funds that might be important to the sector as well.
Okay, there's a lot here. There's one thing I want to just ask you, Zane, as a follow-up question. You used the words build back better, and we've used them at CCVO too, and I think there's something aspirational and interesting there to start to dig into. Someone that is more aligned with the ideology of the provincial government of the day has told me that phrase can be divisive, that it actually sort of feels like it belongs more to the left side of the spectrum than to the right side of the spectrum. So I'm just wondering if you have crossed that before in your thinking or in your work.
Yeah, like I get it from what they're saying, simply because it's been a political phrase that started with the Biden campaign in the US, adopted by the Trudeau Liberals, and now has kind of been used in coordination with this Great Reset sort of mantra. So those two kind of find their rooting in what you call, I don't know, an equitable recovery, right? A recovery that's trying to do a recovery plus, right? Normal wasn't good enough. So certainly, yeah. It depends if you're a nonprofit, which audience you're speaking to, right? I don't think you go down to the provincial government and knocking on their door with a Build Back Better strategy. Let me be candid. I think you try to do that with the federal government, right? You've got bold ambitions. Here's what the sector can do for you, right? And here's what we might be able to execute on. So it's about playing to your audience. But yeah, I'm not surprised that it's a phraseology that simply because of the fact it was incubated and used by the left has been something that the other side of the spectrum maybe rejects.
Thank you. And it sort of leads me to this notion that when we're talking about, there might be a federal download of funding to the municipal level, I think often for nonprofits, it's easier to determine how to work in an advocacy space at the municipal government level, where we tend to know those in power and have closer relationships perhaps with administration. It gets a little bit more difficult at the provincial level. And I think probably with this provincial government, there's sort of an added level of what happens inside executive council and the sort of distance between ministries and executive council potentially, and then harder at the federal level to be on the ground swaying influence. So I'm wondering some strategies from you about what nonprofits can use to exercise influence with governments. And Lindsay, maybe we'll start off with you.
I'm not sure I have a comparative advantage in that area. You know, it's obvious that we are getting more and more polarized in our politics, and that it saddens me a great deal, particularly when we're talking about, you know, these kinds of topics. And one of the things that we've certainly seen is that, let's see, how do I say this? I mean, there are members in this government that are quite vindictive, and when they don't agree with what you're saying, you can often face some fairly serious consequences, whether that be, you know, job loss or your grant leaves or what have you. So I think no matter what, if you're looking for funding from this government, you're just going to have to be careful. And again, that just saddens me a lot. I think with the federal government, you know, it's pretty clear that if you're going to advocacy with the federal government, if you don't understand and apply GBA plus and intersectionality, you're not going to get very far with them at all. They're going to want to see that kind of work done. And I think that is absolutely vital if we are going to build a inclusive and sustainable economy. But I'd also like to caution, just, you know, anybody who follows me on Twitter knows this, is that inclusive and sustainable, all of these kinds of things, intersectionality and GBA plus, is not socialism. This is economics. This is, in fact, Economics 101. And in fact, it's my second lecture in Econ 101, that ensuring that everybody is able to allocate their human capital in the least opportunity cost fashion. That's how we get efficient growth. And we can't do that right now, and we need to do that. So I also do think it's important that everybody understand the economics behind these kinds of ideas, because they are important. It's not about social policy, it's about economic policy.
Thank you. And Mark, you had said off the hop that we don't do a good enough job of advocating for ourselves, and that there's some larger tie that needs to be made. Do you want to add into that a little bit?
Yeah, I think, you know, individually as organizations and collectively as a sector, you need to craft your messages, tailor your messages to the appropriate audiences, the both administrative and political decision makers at each level. Bearing in mind, and it's been touched on earlier, I mean, you know, the folks locally, most of you have had interactions with them. It's more difficult at the federal level. There you may need to speak through an organization like the chamber, as opposed to individually, because it has more force. I mean, there's just too many of you across the country for them to know everyone. So, you know, speaking with a collective voice has more impact. But I'm very mindful of the fact that, you know, this type of advocacy, I'd be hesitant to move to public advocacy as opposed to private advocacy with decision makers. That is always more effective anytime you go to a more public sort of advocacy, particularly if it bristles at the government. It takes longer, it's harder, and it's more expensive. So avoid it if you can, but we'll see.
Yeah, it's a funny sector because some people employ full GR staff and do a lot of private advocacy, but many don't. And so we're sort of all over the spectrum that way. I've seen. Janet or Zane?
I'll go. I mean, it seems really obvious, but I'd say my number one piece of advice is don't make an enemy out of the government. I know these are very contentious times, like Lindsay said, like things are really polarized. And if you feel passionate about something, it's really hard not to go and blow your lid on Twitter. But if you do represent an organization, you know, take a long-term view, take a breath. You know, it's sometimes I sort of tell my clients, like, if you don't like the current government, like just pretend you're a 16-year-old who's biding time before you move out of the house, right? Just try and get along with them. You know, if you mind your P's and Q's, like, who knows, maybe you'll get a TV for your bedroom, like, you know, just but the main thing is as Lindsay said, things are getting, but you know, I'd say social media is getting getting polarized. And I'm not sure that the voters are getting polarized. A couple of years ago, I did a big study for CBC Calgary called The Road Ahead, and a lot of articles were written out of that research. And the single most read article was one called "Are We Conservative?" And basically, because the research showed that no, we're a province of centrist, you know, dominated by sort of a polarized political system. So my number one piece of advice is just you know, they're the government, whether you like it or not. They were all duly elected, and just figure out how to get along with the party of the day, and don't get yourself too embroiled in the negativity.
Thank you. Good words for any time. And Zane, I'll give you the last word on this, but before I do, after this, I'm going to open it up for questions from those of you joining us today. So if you have questions for the panelists, just feel free to enter them into the chat box, and we'll get them to the panelists for the latter half of our conversation. So Zane, tips, tricks, things that nonprofits should be thinking about when they're advocating for their organization in the sector.
Yeah, a few things. Number one is what Mark brought up around coalitions, right? Public policy and advocacy is never and never should be about taking credit. This is not about standing on a mountaintop saying what your organization got done. It's about getting what you need done for your sector and for your organization. And so I know that might be painfully obvious to many of you, but I cannot underline how important that is to success. And if you accept that premise, you then have the ability to partner with organizations that might be what you call day-to-day operating-wise your competition, but are ideologically and values-based and outcome-based your partners. They want the same thing, a rising tide lifts all boats sort of thing. So coalitions, huge, right? If you go out alone, that's great. If you can go together, even better. Let me add a second element or second dimension to the term coalitions, which is this concept of who is your coalition? Who stands behind you? There's a very old, but I think tried and tested phrase by FDR, which he said, "You've convinced me, now make and bring the pressure on me to do it," which ultimately means that, you know, who stands behind you? Who is your coalition? If you're advocating for homelessness, arts and culture, whatever it might be, who stands behind you? How many people stand behind you, and what's the texture of that coalition, and how does it align with the coalition that the government cares about? Is it a coalition that doubles down on their base so they know there's an overlap, or is it a coalition of people that they have not been able to secure that your issue, should they make a certain action on it, they could potentially have? That's important. The second thing I'd say is not to conflate public advocacy with using an opportunity to grow a supporter base. What we're seeing more and more, and I think the charitable sector is really good at a couple of things. They're really good at raising money. They're really good at giving someone's time. What I think we need to have a muscle developed for is having someone lend their voice to you. And when I say voice, I mean someone who's ready to talk about your organization and the value systems you stand for, and frankly, the advocacy objectives you have. So while I agree with Janet's point that you never want to piss off the government, if you feel like you've got a coalition that's decent in size, or you want to use an issue to grow your coalition, I suggest you consider that. I suggest you consider the fact that there are issues on the table right now that people that are in this province that might be lukewarm, engaged on your issue, but supportive of what you care about, might want to join you in that cause. And more, we're starting to see that it's a combination of private government relations and coalition building, which is not always the same thing as large public advocacy campaigns, but to show to government, it's not just me, here's the parade behind me, that I think is the success factor to advocacy. So never, lose the opportunity to build supporters. They are the new oxygen in government relations and advocacy. And it's very simple to do. If I can go one step further, Karen, right? Many organizations here have volunteers, have board members, have staff. I ask you to ask yourself, have you ever asked them to be part of your advocacy? Have you ever asked them, hey, are you willing to lend your voice? Thank you for your time. Thank you for, working on such little pay, but can we ask you for your voice? And building supporters around those that you already have is a great way to start building that coalition. If they can start bringing others into that fold, I could talk a lot deeper about that going forward. So maybe I'll leave my comments there on advocacy tips. Coalitions, two dimensions of it, organizationally and who you represent, and supporters are really the new oxygen to to helping make a less friction path towards getting change from government. So build supporters.
Thank you. It's aspirational and exciting to hear your thoughts on this. I feel like there's never been a better time to advocate for our sector and the work that we're doing. I do have one question coming in from our audience so far, and a bunch more myself, but maybe I'll pose this one. It's a little bit subsector specific, but I think there might be a way to get to an answer to it. It's very particular to gender-based violence sector. So things like such as shelters, social support agencies, etc. The question is, what do you think that sector can expect to see for current and future funding as governments start to consider and make their decisions? And I think maybe Dr. Teds, we can start with you on this one.
Yeah, please. This is an area we've also been working on quite closely with the BC government. And this topic would have traction with this government here in Alberta too, because they are very focused on family and health and safety. And I think that you know, everything that we learned from, I can't believe I say that, everything we learned from this pandemic, we knew it before, but it really brought forth some things. And gender-based violence, intimate partner violence was a big one that came out. Although interestingly, the UK is just reporting their rapes are down 20%. So they're, I don't know, is that a bright side? But so the federal government had a large sum of money that was announced in the spring or summer, I've lost track of time, that was focused on the shelter system, because we don't have enough shelters. So we need better funding to support people fleeing domestic violence and intimate partner violence. They need to be able to have access to lump sum to get themselves set up into housing, appropriate housing for their family situation. And the faster that is done and the better that is done, the less likely they will be returning to their abusive situation. So that I focus a lot on that. And also we need to, it's not expand the shelter system. I think there's some possibility through the, for some sectors, this is a dirty word, Airbnb has a home away program. And it does match people in need of housing, whether it be through fires or earthquakes or things like that. And they have been moving in the area of domestic violence. It wouldn't be suitable for all people. It would depend on the level of security that an individual would need. But at least with home sharing, the supply and product that is on the market, it's usually nice and comfortable. Did I mute myself?
Yeah, just for a sec. We hear you now.
Okay, sorry, that good. And so I'd look to really being creative in this area, and I think that there's going to be a lot of support for work in that area for sure.
Thank you. And you're really the expert on this area in particular, and that was an excellent response. Does anyone want to add into that? Okay, I'll move us on. The next question is really about, so as government resources are stretched, and we certainly know provincially we've heard that a lot, and this notion of service delivery and cost to government. Governments at all orders, I think, are looking for organizations to be more collaborative, or to find ways themselves to collaborate, perhaps attached to saving some resources. So how does an organization position itself in advocacy to say, yes, we're willing to collaborate, we're in it together, but also this is what our organization specifically does. So if you actually have a request that is specific to your organization, how do you balance that, what the coalition or the ability to collaborate with the individual organizational voice? Who maybe wants to take that first? Janet.
I don't know if I have the complete answer, but you know, one of the bad raps that the not-for-profit sector gets all the time is that there's too many organizations, right? There's too many organizations and there's too much overlap. So one of the benefits of collaboration is You know, if you collaborate, if you put yourself in the category of a whole bunch of different organizations, but you can sort of carefully explain what the distinct function of all of them is. So I think you can actually use collaborations to show you know, your unique position in the sector, and also by collaborating, I think you can demonstrate that the sector is really making a concerted effort, you know, to focus on their specialties, to eliminate overlap and that sort of thing. So I'm not sure if that's exactly answers your question, but I do think it's one of the big things that the sector has to fight against. And so as you define yourself, you have to really make sure that you define, you know, the very unique and necessary niche that you occupy, and fight this perception that like there's too many organizations serving too many of the same clients.
Thank you. Anyone want to add into that?
No,
Okay,
I'll underline that. I think that's absolutely right. I would say that that's totally right. And I think your top line message to government is, how can these sectors solve your problem? Period. You've got a problem, we're the solution. You know, here's how we operate. Here's the unique texture that we bring. Here's the geographic areas we can hit on differently, but we'll get your problem solved, right? And I think that's the main sort of headline for extremely busy bureaucrats and political staff and whoever you're talking with. How will this coalition solve your problem? Here is how. Here's the details below the iceberg. But the top of the iceberg above the water is the strategic angle. We can get this done. And I think that's the headline you want to kind of lean with in many ways.
Thank you. There was a question about ROI. So we've talked a lot about showing economic impact, and I think there's always sort of an onus on nonprofits to have an instrumental impact that aligns with the economy, particularly at this time. It's not going away anytime soon. But how do we show ROI in terms beyond economic value to governments that are focused on, one might say, almost exclusively the economy at this time?
I think part of it is, you know, it depends upon the nature of the organization itself. It's not just your ability to deliver a service efficiently. I think in many respects you have to make government think, but for the existence of this organization, what would the cost be on society and the cost on government? Because ultimately these things do come home to roost for government if somebody doesn't deal with it. And this has been a message that's been worked very effectively with homelessness, with a variety, for instance, the drug court. You talk about you know, this revolving cycle of people getting arrested, getting processed, getting kicked back, and the cost to the system when you're paying, you know, the average policeman, by the time you got benefits and equipment, at 150 grand a year, their time is valuable. And if all you're doing with these people is cycling them through the system, that's an enormous cost on government that could be solved quite efficiently by just giving a little bit of money to an organization that really knows how to specialize in it. And it's been a very effective argument across the spectrum in terms of different organizations going through this with government.
Yeah, so know how you partner with government and what they care about and how you're delivering in that partnership.
Yeah, and I think the added benefit, if I can add to Mark's point, is agility. Right? Not only are you a service deliverer that isn't like government, which is this tank trying to make a U-turn, which can take forever. You're this small targeted vehicle that can quickly do that. So you're agile, but you have the added benefit of also having your pulse with the community that you serve. So it's not like you're having to go 3-4 layers deep in order to then find an execution partner. You are the execution partner. You know what needs to be done. So the cost savings in that sort of system and the agility as the environment changes, you can change, I think is a huge part of that ask, right? Which is why, you know, traditionally, if I can put this in air quotes, conservative governments have liked nonprofits in many cases, right? Despite what we hear in the headlines of funding cuts in various sectors, which is not you know, wrong. They have preferred nonprofits for other things, which is, we don't want to bring this in-house. Can you solve our problem? Yes or no? Is it yes? Great. Like, you know, just get it done. And to be able to do it cheaper and with agility and perhaps with more domain expertise than an in-house government program, 3 layers deep into the bureaucracy, no offense to our public servants, is an interesting proposition to government. So I would just put the agility piece really at front and center alongside cost savings as well.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to try to combine a couple questions because we have many questions coming in fast and furious. Someone has commented that they understood that this provincial government was a bit taken aback by the public response to the delisting of parks and the Save Our Parks campaign, and then the subsequent "Don't Go Breaking My Parks," and then the subsequent "My Parks Will Go On." And so I think the general question is, are there lessons to be learned from this, from putting something so public out there that then becomes a political fight? And, you know, how do you stay under the radar? Should they have stayed under the radar? Comments around that when you have something of an issue of that size and magnitude.
I can start
first.
Jump
in.
No, Mark has to go next because I want to know what that smirk means. But there was a lot of lessons to be learned, primarily from the provincial government. And what's happening right now with this provincial government is, you know, they had this like 300-page policy book when they got elected, and you know, and they're just trying to sort of drive it through, and they're not letting COVID slow them down at all. And I think they're making a lot of communications mistakes because they're sort of, you know, they push out the policy before they've really thought through the communications. And you know, one of the things that happened with the parks was, you know, the government had some sort of, like, they talked about modernizing the parks, and it was like, what does that mean? But then on one of their websites, it said delisting. And so people were able to jump on that, and as far as I know, there was only like one place on the government website where it had the word delisting. But the fact of the matter is, they didn't take the time to clean up all their communications, to have a clear message before they made that announcement. And you know, and I think there was you know, I think if they had sort of released this strategy and talked about, like, look, we're looking for people to partner with so we can run our parks better. If that was the initial communications message they came out with, it would have been much harder to counter. But they just didn't. They just released the policy, and they weren't really prepared to speak to it in sort of a meaningful way. And then it's taken them weeks and weeks to get positive communications messages. So, I mean, they just left the door wide open for the kind of criticism that you got. Now, were the organizations that jumped on the bandwagon and slapped their logo on lawn signs, was this a good long-term strategy? I don't know. Like, you know, there's lots of those signs in my community. It was sort of great to see some grassroots things sort of or blow up like this, but you know, will it come back to bite them that they allowed their logos to go on those signs?
Yeah, Mark?
Yeah, I agree with Jenna. I mean, it goes back to the point about private advocacy versus public advocacy. I think it was a very effective campaign. I mean, you see lots of the signs, but did they get what they wanted? In many respects, in terms of the actual policy, they may be farther back than when they started, because as Janet noted, I mean, this is largely a communication screw up. They launched it just so ham-handedly. Whereas if that was dealt with privately through advocacy, going, is that really what you mean? Is that, but now it's turned into a big thing. The government becomes more rigid about it. You have the NDP picking up, so now it becomes partisan, and there's no closing that gap anymore.
Yeah,
people are locked in place. So I think it was a very effective campaign, but did they get what they wanted? In many respects, I mean, for the people who managed to get out the vote, all you've done is you've given the minions and the conservatives the ability to walk down the street and add notes to their nation builder file. So, you know, I would be very careful about that kind of advocacy. It really is a last resort.
Yeah. Thank you. We're almost at time. We could probably talk for another hour. There's so many questions, and it really tells me what a great panel this has been, how much interest there is in it. Before we wrap, I have one final question, just rapid fire. We're headed, I think we can fairly say, into, if we're not already into it, a second wave of COVID as we start all of these levels of budgets. Can you maybe just very quickly, one thing that you think our current climate might be doing to affect budget decisions, the pandemic climate, that nonprofits may want to look at or watch. So something that might be changing in a dynamic environment that we're headed into through any level of government that you might want to comment on. Zane, can I ask you first? You look kind of, I'm not sure, I can see the wheels turning.
Yeah, sure. I'll just highlight what I said initially. Does the federal government still have the appetite? If they do, this could be a net win for the nonprofit sector, especially many who have social sector causes, arts-based causes, to keep the money flowing, to execute upon a new vision of Canada. There's politics involved here, 100%. This is a prime minister who sees an opportunity to perhaps even create a legacy from the remake of COVID on the heels of handling COVID relatively well thus far for the nation. So could this be a legacy piece? No doubt. So there's politics involved in that. Can we as a charitable sector be beneficiaries of that? That is what I'm looking for. Monday's what I'm looking for. I will also quickly add, to the heels of the last conversation, kudos to Defend Alberta Parks. Excellent campaign. I believe they launched that campaign knowing that they weren't going to get any movement from the government in a considerable policy-related sense, but what they got was demonstrating an unbelievable size of population across this province that support parks. And that is a coalition that they now have access to that they can use going forward. So I'm not disagreeing with Janet and Mark, but I do think this is where I talked about supporter bases and why they're so important. They have one now, and that's really unique and really useful going forward. So those are my closing comments.
Thank you. And you know what? I asked for closing comments, but I think we're set till 3:30, so this is my fault.
Great.
I'm gonna ask you all these more questions, but I do want these comments. COVID, pandemic, and what it means at any order of government right now as we head into a second wave. Janet, do you want to jump in?
Again, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but this is what we political commentators do. We just answer the question we want to answer. But one of the things I'm looking ahead to is I'm going to be sort of eating my popcorn, watching politicians have to step out of their ideological realm, because these tough times are going to call for politicians to make decisions that go against their sort of ideological bent. And like I said, I'm just going to be eating my popcorn watching this. So, you know, the federal government, as you know, we've talked about, they've got a lot of capacity, they've got a lot of runway. You know, this fiscal update could be the opportunity to show that, you know, they're really ready to spend some money to move us from, as Mark said, sort of, you know, resilience to recovery. But you know, at the same time, Justin Trudeau, the Liberals, they are going to have to talk about the financial side of things, right? The NDP here in Alberta, they are going to have to talk about, you know, how are we going to pay off all this money at the end of the day? So, you know, they can't, you know, just because they're Liberals doesn't mean they can ignore conservative issues. And then, you know, just the other day, you know, when Jason Kenney stood up and said, look, I didn't get into public office to tell people they couldn't have friends over to their house, but here he is doing it, right? And also, I think it's going to be really interesting to watch this provincial government. Like, people are sort of saying like, oh, there's going to be huge cutbacks. It's going to be like a bloodbath. And I think, well, if you want to know what the federal, or if you want to know what the provincial United Conservative Party is going to do, take a look at what the Stephen Harper government did during the global economic downturn, right? They did all sorts of sort of public works programs. There was like a sign on the highway, like every 12 miles saying, look at this project we're doing, look at this. So what was that project called? Does anybody remember I can't remember the government's, you know, building I
remember the logo with the arrows going up, but I can't remember the name.
Right,
Building
but
Canada.
Building Canada, yeah. So it's going to be really kind of ironic to watch, you know, Jason Kenney, you know, spearhead a Building Alberta program and defying some of his conservative instincts in order to get the economy building back. So for the sector, I think that's maybe a little bit of a window of opportunity, is that don't get too hung up on the ideology of the government in power, because in times like this, everybody has to step outside of their ideology from time to time.
Thank you. And Mark?
Yeah, I mean, to Janet's point, with the exception of the municipal government, the other two orders of government, they're less concerned about deficit spending. And they're less concerned about, I mean, the feds were never particularly concerned about it, but the province is less concerned about it because the public is. If you look at where public concern about debt and deficits was, even in the fall and September, It's dropped 10 points in terms of public concern since then. Like, it's down towards the bottom of the list. They're worried about jobs, the economy. They're worried about COVID. They're worried about healthcare. So, you know, philosophically, the UCP may still be concerned about debt and deficits, but the public isn't as much right now. And there's a window there to use that. Another thing is, to Janet's point about governments are thinking creatively and want to think creatively and want you to offer them ideas that are maybe a little bit different. It goes to, you know, the red tape in government. A lot of, you take for example, affordable housing. A lot of the restrictions on affordable, they live hand to mouth for government grants because of the way that the leasing and ownership structure is comprised for their facilities. They can't go to the bank and borrow money. Well, that's something the government could change with the stroke of a pen. But it's that kind of thing. I mean, geez, they were putting out a red tape press release today about cutting a $5 charge on cutting down trees for Christmas on Crown land. They're dying for material. Give them something. And then finally, I think, you know, for those who deliver certain services, the COVID provides a certain insurance or a certain insulation against cuts from government. And you see it, what's going on with public response to, you know, the provincial government getting into fights with healthcare workers and doctors and nurses in the middle of a pandemic. I mean, the public reaction is visceral. So for any government to be making cuts to not-for-profit agencies who provide services to people who are hurting during a pandemic, or for problems that have become accelerated because of the pandemic, God help them, they'll be in deep trouble.
Yep, thank you. And Lindsay.
Yeah, I'll sort of build off. I mean, everything that I said that has already been said here, I think is great. I'll just do one little add-on to something that I said about, you know, the nonprofit, not-for-profit sector being able to support government delivery. And I talked about, you know, their benefits. But we are going to need, the federal government is going to, and this provincial government is going to need help to deliver that vaccine to that same vulnerable population, and that is going to be so important to be able to protect you know, highly vulnerable populations, and also, you know, the new refugees. You know, so working in that area, I think there's a lot of potential. Now, we've also seen the federal government, more so than the provincial government, talk about supply chain management, and in particular, reminds me of going back to World War I and World War II, where we talk about having in-house capacity. I think there is some room there for the sector to play a role in that capacity building as well.
Thank you. I have a couple more questions now that we have this bonus 30 minutes that wasn't on my clock, which is great. I'm glad, because there are quite a few questions coming in. One question is about the effect of if we go from the position that there might be tension between each order of government right now in Alberta. What do these tensions mean? What effect might they have? Zane, you talked about the federal government as being maybe the place we should be thinking and looking at most clearly as providing some of the investments in the work that we do as a sector. But what does it mean if there's tension in the relationship between the federal government, the provincial government, and potentially between the provincial and municipal governments right now in Alberta for how these fundings might flow or be directed? Do you want to take that first, Zane?
I would just reiterate Mark's point, which I do not want us to lose in the mix, which is the fund share agreements, right? Often this is a 70-30, 60-40, sometimes 50-50 splits that the Fed funding is contingent on having matching, sometimes two, often all three orders of government. So it is that I think could be the hiccup here that I think is important for us to know. So I think the advocacy sort of nodes are unlocking the funding, i.e. ensuring that the feds understand that they've got support for their ideology, that polling of people concerned about deficits, you know, for them, they need to ensure that that remains at the bottom of the list so they can feel comfortable right? Unlocking the funding. And then it's kind of about the other two orders of government kind of having that same sensibility, saying, yeah, we know this is money that does need to be spent, and we're going to jump in as well. What governments will always consider is who's getting the blame and the focal point of whose program this really is. And it's really an ironic situation, because often it's programs that are funded largely by the federal government that municipalities claim as their success point, right? We took about transit, other funding, and being like, yep, this is a municipal thing. We're really owning it. I feel like this is going to be really different in many ways, where you're seeing almost everyone trying to kind of shy away from it, so as their money that they put on the table is less about money that they put out on the table, but more so money that they had to put out on the table to match a federal program. So that's kind of my initial thoughts, just doubling down on what Mark's saying there. That's where the rub really happens, which is, will these matching funds be triggered? And I think the government is probably willing to go far enough in certain cases where, if they know they have a government that isn't playing ball, watch them to just fund the whole thing. And we're seeing that a bit, bypassing and funding entire tranches of cash directly.
And I go back to what I originally said, and don't forget about the electoral cycle of each of these governments, right? So, we could have a federal government as early as this spring. And let's say the Liberals win a majority, but get no seats in Alberta, right? That's going to change the dynamic of the relationship. If the Conservatives win, that changes the dynamic as well. We're less than a year away from the next municipal election. There's talks about, slates of candidates being put forward and stuff like that. I mean, if the complexion of city council, I know there's people on the line outside of Calgary, but if the complexion of city council changes, then that changes the relationship with the provincial government a lot. And the provincial government's the one that's going to be, around the longest for sure. So it's not just the tensions that exist. There's always tensions. You can guarantee that, but the tensions are always, are always changing and always evolving.
Thanks. And I'm wondering, there's another question here speaking about election cycles that's related to upstream delivery. So particularly maybe with things like the cultural sector or the arts sector, where they're not delivering frontline services right now. They're not directly seen as part of the recovery plan, but those sectors need to be on their feet to deliver the kinds of impacts that have potentially a future value that exists beyond a political cycle. So in this sort of day of political cycles, where 4 years or 2 years or whatever we're dealing with at any given time, how do organizations that are positioning on longer term views and longer term impacts effectively make that case or position themselves inside government budget cycles and political cycles?
I tend to disagree. I tend to see the arts and culture sector as being part of the recovery. Someday we'll actually be able to leave our houses and go sit in concert halls again. Won't that be exciting? And when we do, those organizations have to be there. So it's really, the message to government is these organizations need a lifeline that's going to allow them to persist and exist past this, because when the economic recovery comes, you want people out spending money again. And guess what? People like to spend money on arts and culture and doing stuff. And they have had 9 months of not being able to do stuff, and they're dying to do it. So you need these organizations to be there. So it may not be, big funding, but it'll be funding that will help sustain you to get past this, is really, I think, what you're after.
And the focus is going to be so much on jobs and small business. And, so if I own a restaurant, in the entertainment district, I need the live music to come back so that my restaurant can come back, right? And so, I mean, I can't think of a subsector within the sector that can't make the jobs claim, right? Like, and this will be the number one thing, is like getting people back to work. It's going to be critical for addressing mental health issues. It's going to be critical for, addressing all the sort of, systematic, the systematic, poverty problems and everything like that. So, yeah, talk about the number one thing on your communication should be the jobs that your subsector represents, and all jobs matter, whether they're frontline or not.
Yeah, and,
Yeah, and of
we
course,
know that.
I was just going to say, don't forget the impact outside of just your sector. So arts jobs affect restaurant jobs. They affect other kinds of jobs in the economy as well. But Zane, sorry to cut you off there.
No, I want to make mention that I think, at least on a municipal side, their decision-making model has a three-prong approach. They're looking at physical health, they're looking at economic health, and they're looking at mental health. So if and any government advocacy or government messaging is their problem and your puzzle piece, how well does it fit? So to Mark's point, don't think you're outside of the recovery. Even if you don't believe that, find a way to message that you are the recovery, that you are crucial to the recovery. And the way I look at it, you intersect with two, if not all three, of the core priorities. This is definitely economic health. We talked about the cascading effects of jobs, restaurateurs, art sector, of course, but mental health, like who else? There's going to be downstream effects of this crisis, and arts and culture is a way for us to ensure that the physical and mental health of people is not just repaired in many ways, but continues to be strong, because there are downstream effects that no government wants to face, especially with the unpredictability of them on the heels of this. So your puzzle piece needs to match theirs, and put it in that frame, because it is in that frame. So I would kind of be less, gun shy to be like, oh, well, we're not in the current bucket. Oh no, you are, because and just really be assertive as to how you fit into this recovery. To Mark's point, and you fit in at least two, if not three, of the buckets that at least our municipal government, and I suspect our provincial and federal governments, are looking at in terms of how they matrix out funding and spending.
Mark.
And one other thing, it's interesting about COVID because it's changed the way we do work. Everybody's working from home now. Hardly anybody goes into work anymore. And it really has emphasized this notion of remote working. And in order to attract economic growth and people who want to live in your city, it's not about having to be next to the place where you work anymore. It's about being in a city that I want to be in. So I think that's where the arts and culture side of things really does dovetail into it nicely. We are going to be living in a new reality past COVID, where I could go live in the Bahamas and work if I want. Well, but I want to live here because it's close to the mountains and I like doing stuff here. This is my home. So, but I think that becomes, being a destination is much more important.
And we talk all about diversification, right? And how are you going to get like these, highly qualified, tech sector employees to come to Calgary? Calgary's got and sorry, and I know there's people on the line that aren't from Calgary, but Calgary, Edmonton, like we have to be places that people want to live, so we can bring in the diversified kind of workforce that everybody is talking about we need.
Yeah, totally. Okay, I have two questions, and then that is it, because we are ending at 3:30. But this one's a little bit more specific. I'll just read it directly. Any recommendations for when to go directly to the feds, and what kind of federal messaging, as opposed to provincial government, if the provincial government isn't prioritizing the issue? The example they're using here is childcare. So if the feds flow the funds to the province, they're not effectively used to their greatest impact and the problem isn't solved. Is there a role for nonprofits to go right to the feds for this type of situation? What message, what caution? And Lindsay, do you have a lived experience with this?
Well, I don't know. So maybe I don't understand the sector well enough. Why you wouldn't just go where the funding and the interest is? And so for a lot, that is going to be the federal government, and they're going to have a lot more funds available as well. But like on the child care aspect, I mean, it is possible to use the information that you do have about their ideology and how they're going to support the child care sector, because one of the things that they did do, this UCP government, was enrich that child care subsidy. And I released a piece on this today. There's still a lot of room in that policy to be improved. And so I wouldn't give, as much as I do sort of feel like at times you just want to give up because they just don't seem to get it. There does seem to be these little nugget areas that they do seem to understand in ensuring that childcare is affordable to the lower income individuals. That's what the subsidy is for. And so you can look at the changes that they just made with simply indexing it for the last 12 years. That's the kind of catch up that they did. But there's lots of areas still within that policy that can be improved. So yeah, I wouldn't necessarily give up on this government, but make sure you understand that they're not going to be like the feds, who apparently are going to have a whole dedicated, if the leaks are right, there's going to be a whole dedicated entity within the federal government on childcare.
Okay, thank you. Anyone want to add into that? All right, I'm gonna. Oh, sorry, Janet, please.
I was just going to say, like, I mean, I think the best day to, you know, talk to government is yesterday, and the second best day to talk to them is today. I think there's different work when you're talking to different governments at different stages, but obviously you've got to, obviously there's a different opportunity with the federal government than there is to the provincial government. So you've got to be talking to government, and you've got to be recognizing that different governments are in different places on different issues.
Thanks. Okay, this is the last question. We'll go around, but I think it's a really good one. So as we head into 2021, your best advice for one thing nonprofits need to stop and one thing we need to start doing as we head into 2021. Janet, do you want to jump in?
That's a good question. It's not on my preset list of questions, Karen. That's
Sorry.
a trick question. I don't want to go over old territory, but I'd say, like, the thing to stop is, you know, just stop feeding into the negativity. I know it's, you know, set yourself up an alias if you really feel like you have to be a smart aleck on Twitter 3 times a day, but, you know, really take a, so I'd say that the thing to stop is just, you know, causing yourself troubles in the short term. The thing to start is taking a very long-term view. And I just love the way Mark laid this out at the beginning with, you know, resilience, recovery, and then how do we pay for it? And I would map out a very long-term strategy. And if you have that long-term strategy, then hopefully you'll be less likely to get caught in the day-to-day machinations of politics, and you can keep your focus on the long game.
Thank you. Zane?
Stop being shy and start understanding that your organization has a voice, and start building that voice with those that are around you. There is a group of folks around your organization that are disproportionately engaged with what you do. Your board, your staff, your volunteers, they have a level of engagement that anyone would kill for about you. And they've given time, they've given resources, they may have taken a pay cut to work with you. That's excellent and should be rewarded. But now let's ask them to say, could you donate your voice? And start getting folks into your fold that can be supporters. The more folks that you have that are able to flex their voice, and the less shy you are as an organization. I know there's a conversation around, you know, don't bite the hand that feeds you, but you live values. You live what you are. And what I would say is that many organizations on this call represents the most vulnerable in our society. You know, I often hear the phrase that COVID didn't discriminate. Well, yes, it did. It hit people who were poorer. It hit people that looked like me, that were racialized. You want to know why there's so many cases in the Northeast? Because a lot of the people that are my relatives, friends, and family have to go to work every day. Now, they don't get to sit on my couch like me with my sweatpants right now. They had to go to work, right? No, they seriously did. And so the fact is, this thing discriminated in a disproportionate way to people that were on our front lines, people that were poor, people that were racialized. And often you are the organizations that represent those people, that provide the services to help them create a better life, to help them find their footing, and help them to be fuller citizens in our society. So don't be shy of the voice you have, and don't be shy what you're able to do with that voice. Those would be my 2 things that I'd say.
And I want to support your point, Zane, and say all the things, the needing to go to work and all of those things, and living in challenging housing situations is another one,
100%.
right? It's
100%.
easy to isolate when you have more rooms in your house than you have occupants of that house, and people who live in communal settings are very challenged right now.
Yeah, especially when you have 1 or 2 people that have to go to work, right? Even if everyone else can stay home. I mean, we just do the math, the bubble just grows. It's no longer that household, right? And that, it just, in a very simplified way, is you know, a relationship with what we're seeing happen in certain parts of our community. So as organizations who represent and help and serve and are dedicated, please don't be shy of the voice that you have and the voice that you collectively as individuals who are engaged with your organization have as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Lindsay?
Okay, I'm unmuted. I happily get to be smart arse on Twitter, and I get paid for that. So my communications director doesn't always like it, but so I won't. I'll let Janet give you that advice, because I can't. I hope this doesn't come off the wrong way. What I would say is, I think it's building a bit on what Zane said. Be bold and be innovative. You know, I too often see some organizations just picking around the edges as opposed to some real changes that we can make. And I'm coming off of a 2.5-year huge project with the BC government to improve their entire system. One of the mantras we were using was radical incrementality, so that you got to work with the system that you have, but you can be pretty radical with it if you can just get the evidence behind you. And I have to admit, we're really excited for our report to come out in January, because I'm just super, super excited. And think about people like me as, one, I do need to raise money, as do you. But, people like me and Jennifer Robson at Carleton and Tammy Sherrill at Wilfrid Laurier, and there's a lot of women out there who do this kind of analysis, who can help you match the academic literature that you may not be as familiar with, to move more on evidence for radical incrementality and real policy change. So don't forget about us. You don't just have to read our stuff. You could actually talk to us, and we can help you where we can. And maybe I'm just feeling a little too giddy off of the experience I've just had, but I think there's a lot of room for that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's an important point to make about allyship and who's all in this together, and the voices that we can bring forward. And Mark, last word goes to you.
Well, I think we've seen this sort of globally, and politically, people are becoming more polarized, and that lens tends to frame how they see the world. And I think that there's a temptation to look at different governments and maybe draw assumptions about the degree to which they can and will help you based upon your assumptions. So my advice would be, stop that. There is a way to get whatever you want out of any government. It doesn't matter what political stripe they are. It's a matter of developing a strategy that both meets your needs and theirs. And what I think the sector really needs to do is really focus on telling their story, telling the right story to the right audiences at the right time. So it's about tailoring your message to the decision makers that you want to reach. And those would be the 2 things that sort of go hand in hand.
Thank you. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today on behalf of everyone that's here on this call, and certainly on behalf of CCVO. We've just been so privileged to have your wise voices helping us as we think about budgets and advocacy and how to support the nonprofit sector going forward. I took a lot out of today's conversation, starting with the fact that we have to draw that line between resilience, recovery, and what we want our society and our community to look like in the future, and that government is there with us, and often we're the link between government and the most vulnerable, and we have to think carefully about how we form coalitions and we make that known as we move forward, to use our voice. And I love that the best day to talk to government was yesterday, or the second best day, and the best day is today. Also, Zane's wearing sweatpants, which I adore. So on behalf of CCVO, our staff and our board, thank you all so much for joining us today. I'd also like to thank our supporters of today's conversation. Once again, the Motart Foundation, PwC Canada, Suncor Energy Foundation, and our media partner, Post Media. As we've heard today, I think numerous times, our future prosperity will be built through strategies that involve commitments from multiple orders of government, and not just from governments, but from ourselves as a sector, from those that support us, and from the private sector. And CCVO is working on developing a community prosperity strategy for Alberta, and has recently published a blog outlining our 2 key recommendations for the Government of Alberta. You can find this post and others, as well as get involved, on the link on your screen. Thank you again to everyone who attended today, our panelists, our supporters, the CCVO staff who worked very hard to pull this event together. Please take a moment to complete the short survey that you'll see pop up after this gathering ends. And in case you don't get a chance to share your feedback today, we'll also include the survey and some great links that have been provided by our panelists in a follow-up email to continue to engage in this discussion. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Stay warm, and I hope you can join us again soon. Thank you.